Explosions. Instead of damaging one thing, they damage everything near them. This behavior in game design is known as splash damage, or AoE, which stands for Area of Effect. Understanding it can be the difference between losing all of your units and barely losing any at all. While this can seem very obvious to veteran RTS players, I thought it'd be a good idea to quickly summarize some ways to minimize this damage for beginner players. The two most common sources of splash damage in Supreme Commander 2 are bombers and mobile artillery, with the biggest difference between the two being the ability to dodge mobile artillery shots while bombs are homing and will always hit their target. That is why against mobile artillery it is recommended to move in a zigzag pattern, changing directions to avoid taking any hits at all. In land versus land fights, it's always beneficial to squeeze your units together as much as possible by holding control when giving movement orders to enable more of your units to participate in the fight and not be out of range. If your land army is being bombed though, things are different. The bombs will always hit their target unless something else is in the way, which can sometimes be used to protect your engineers, but when it's your land army being bombed out in the open, the only way to minimize this damage is to spread your units. By spreading your units over a larger area, less units will be affected per explosion thanks to the decreased density. But how do you efficiently spread the units? The first way would be to just give a movement order without holding control, right? The problem is that this doesn't always work, and when it does, it can take up to 7 seconds for the units to form a grid. That is simply time you usually don't have, especially when you're in the middle of a land battle and you have to keep switching between clumping up your units to optimize your damage output and splitting up your units to minimize damage from bombs. For a couple units, it's okay to individually split them up, but what about larger groups, like 64 units for example? A naive approach would be to immediately divide the army into, let's say, groups of 4 units. Splitting your army up to the point where each bomb will damage only one unit is overkill, so groups of 4 should do. 64 divided by 4, that is 16 movement orders. The problem with this approach is that if you get bombed before you finish, you risk taking a big hit in an area you didn't focus on. It can also be tough to keep track of where each tiny subgroup is going. Another problem is also the fact that you have to start from the outside to make space for the units on the inside, which are usually the target anyway. Instead, let's try splitting the 64 units into 2 subgroups. And then split each subgroup in 2 again, and again, and again. By this point we have subgroups of 4 units, but the amount of movement orders hasn't really changed. Doing it this way has big advantages though. As you're splitting the army into the first couple chunks, it makes it much easier to see what units the bombers are converging on and focus on splitting up that subgroup over others. And this time, if you get bombed before you finish the split, the first 4 or 5 movement orders are already enough to substantially decrease the splash damage everywhere. It is simply just a more reliable approach that makes it visually easier to organize the subgroups and transition from a clumped up army to a spread out army more gradually. Think of tree branches. The first approach is basically immediately splitting the main branch into 16 tiny ones. You can't see where the bombs are going until you've separated that group from the rest. If you're doing the second approach and dividing the army into subgroups, you have plenty of time to see where the bombs are going and focus on that group to split it up as much as possible. Obviously, this is going to look a lot messier in practice and needs constant improvisation. The person bombing also has some tricks up his sleeve. When you're bombing a land army, it's better to split your air force into groups and target different spots to spread the damage more evenly. All of these small interactions then depend on the experience and speed of each player. Take too slow to split your units up and you can lose dozens in a single explosion that could have killed 3 or 4 instead. Fly too close to some anti-air and you can lose half your air force. Focus too much on splitting your units in a land battle and the enemy land army will dominate. By the way, spreading units to minimize splash damage also applies to structures. Never build turrets right next to each other or in a line, always leave tiny gaps in between. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one. What? You still haven't joined the biggest Supreme Commander 2 Discord in the world with over 1,000? 2,000? You have General, Hall of Fame, all the YouTube channels, all the YouTube videos, streaming, don't worry about that. Ask for some help, post some memes, send some replays, find a game, dead chat. We even have a channel for all the Xbox Subcom 2 players. So what are you waiting for? Click the first link in the video description or just type Supreme Commander 2 in this thing that nobody will ever use. You should join now!
Oh yeah.
Wow, what the fuck?
How did you do that?
Yeah, I have to use that now.